Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. I'm joined today, as always, by Clark Coffey,
Hello,
my
hello,
lovely
hello.
co-host.
Thank you, thank you,
Um,
thank you.
yeah. Today we're doing Denis Villeneuve's Enemy from 2013, and this is, of course,
Ooh.
episode 47. So we're nearly at 50, which is kind of
I
crazy.
It's kind of crazy. It's amazing, and
Hmm.
I'm excited for this conversation. This is
Yeah.
your choice. A fellow Canadian filmmaker from Toronto, or at least if I don't know if he's from Toronto. He's
Well, yeah,
from
he's
Quebec.
from Montreal.
He's from
Yeah.
Quebec, but
Hmm.
this of course this film takes place and very prominently highlights Toronto.
Yes,
So that's
which
a
is
cool
surprising. Well, he's
connection.
actually from Trois-Rivières, but that's a small town. So
Yeah.
Montreal, but and Quebec, but yeah. So this is one of the few movies again that we discussed this about when we were doing The Fly, where I said that there's a lot of movies that are shot in Toronto, but very few actually take place in Toronto.
Yeah.
Usually, it's like subbing out for New York or Chicago or some generic kind of American city.
Yep. And
Um,
this is very clearly Toronto, and I have
yes,
to say
yeah.
it makes Toronto, which is a beautiful city, and I've been there personally, and it's a beautiful city. Boy, this film makes Toronto look horrible.
Yeah, lots of it's like I always laugh at that and I said this before, but I was watching this at a friend's and we were in like a condo, and there's like a nice view of the lake, and you can actually see the building that we were in the movie, but there's you can see the city, and it's a really beautiful view.
Yeah.
And it was so funny watching the movie and kind of like turning my head to the right, looking out the window and seeing what the city actually looks like versus what the movie makes it look like, which is like this smoggy,
Yeah, smoggy, yellow,
gross,
oppressive.
dirty,
Yeah.
and with giant spiders in the sky, of course.
With giant
Um,
spiders in the sky. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's interesting. I would say that this is a very Canadian movie, and we're going to get into kind of more what that
Yeah.
means later
That's
on. But I think
intriguing
it's
to me.
very it's got a lot of like Canadian identity in it in terms of the way that, and perhaps for better or for worse in some ways. Sometimes it's a pro, sometimes it's a con. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, I guess we can kind of get into kind of our first impressions in context.
Or even maybe if you want to just a hair before we do that,
Mhm.
it's kind of you and I, so just so everybody out there listening kind of knows, and you probably suspect, we pop on for a brief period of time before we record, and we kind of very, very high level kind of discuss the film, and we kind of break out a few notes of things that we want to talk to, but we don't pre-can this or pre-plan this. It's all improvised, recorded live, and we don't even edit it. It's like we
Yeah.
present this thing as one big old slab of an hour-long conversation, and that's that. So
Raw conversation.
no tricks up our sleeves of any kind. But we were talking about, and I think it's interesting. This film was made in what, 2013, so not too long ago. But I think in 8 years, we've seen some interesting things kind of happen, or the progression of things that have been happening for a while in the film industry have been happening. And of course, especially COVID has had a big impact on cinema and the theatrical experience with film. But, you brought up a good question during that conversation, which was like, is this a good example of a film that would have a difficult time being made and theatrically released today? And we were kind of talking about how this is likely a film that, maybe would end up on Netflix now or Amazon Prime, and, maybe would end up, just as one of like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of films kind of, buried amongst all the quote unquote content. But I mean, that's a good question, and what are your thoughts on that? I mean, this film is definitely, it's an esoteric, it's a film that it's definitely not a Marvel movie.
It's not a blockbuster by any means. Yeah,
Not a
yeah, I know. I think
blockbuster.
that I sort of described it as like a relic of a time past, in a sense, in that like it feels very 70s in a way, 70s kind of 80s, or even, I know that this is 90s, but I always sort of think of like Eyes Wide Shut when I think of this movie, in that it's like a big, and again, this is not an old movie, this is 2013.
Yeah.
But the amount that the film industry has changed in the past 5-10 years is, I think, basically a ton. I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's astronomical.
Especially,
How
you know, I
much things
think,
have changed.
and COVID has hastened that. You know, the past 2
Yes,
years
absolutely. It's
has
kind of
been,
it's been the
yeah,
straw that broke the camel's back in many senses. But that this this movie reminds me again. I said Eyes Wide Shut, but it also kind of tonally reminds me almost of like The Conversation.
hmm.
Like it's this surreal kind of paranoia thriller
Mm-hmm.
drama, and
Yep.
movies like that aren't really made like that anymore, like, and let alone shown in theaters with budgets of what I'm not quite sure. Let me try and pull up the number here real quick,
I think we're looking at
if it's
it.
available.
Yeah. It's
But
I don't see any numbers available right off the top, but you know, I mean,
yeah,
it's
I'd say it's made for a few $1 million, probably.
probably
you
not
know
much, but you know,
yeah.
Jake Gyllenhaal, you know, he did a couple films with Denny back to back, I think, and so I'm not quite sure, you know, if they did kind of a multi-pick deal or kind of, you know, how much he got paid for this, you know, and but yeah, you know, it's interesting. And we're going to get into this, you know, kind of, you know, what our experiences were with the film, and I'll kind of cheat a little bit and share that, you know, I didn't really enjoy this film much, but and we'll get into this, but I really respect the film, and I'm appreciative of the film, and I'm appreciative that Denny is working in the industry, that he's a filmmaker that's making films, and I appreciate that this film exists, and I would love to see more films like this being released theatrically, you know, mature films made for adult viewing audience, you know, exploring interesting and complex adult issues.
Yeah.
And making strong artistic choices, which, I mean, look, you can say all kinds of things about this film, but the one thing that's undeniable is that there are strong choices being made in this film.
Yeah.
And even if I am not thrilled by those choices, I'm always thrilled by the fact that somebody actually made strong choices.
I think it's interesting because our reaction to this movie is very much kind of two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Whereas you don't necessarily enjoy it a lot. I agree with all of the things that make you not enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. But
I disagree on a stylistic level with this movie a ton. It's not
Yeah.
a movie that I think I would ever, like, I would never shoot a movie in this style. And I don't just mean subject matter or story. I think that that's a really engaging and intriguing part of the movie. And I love those types of movies. But
Yeah.
purely from a stylistic sense, purely from a visual, the way the camera moves, the cinematography of the movie, I would never shoot anything like this.
The filter.
Yes, yeah. It's super yellow and stuff like that, and I very wholeheartedly disagree with that on a like artistic, personal level.
Yeah.
But I find it really fascinating too.
Sure.
I find that it's almost something I can't look away from, and it's not a movie that, I don't think that Villeneuve was trying to make, or Nicholas Bolduc, who did the cinematography, were trying to make this movie look pretty. It's very obvious that they were trying to make it look ugly.
No question.
And it works. It definitely is not a pretty movie, but I think it's so fascinating because of that.
Yeah.
That it's like, to me, it's like you're looking at this image and it's so yellow, or the landscape shots, or like the big establishing shots of the city are so smoggy and gross, and they make you feel almost like you're in like a bayou, like it's like sweaty, and just it's not appealing in any
makes me feel like I'm in
way.
Los Angeles in the 70s, what it makes me feel like.
Yeah.
But okay, so we're going to talk about that because I think this is really interesting. This is, now look, I think this is a compliment to the film, the fact that we're here, that we're talking about it, and that there's there's the complexity of this issue to even discuss, I think is worthwhile. I mean, that this is huge points, in favor of the film.
Absolutely.
This idea that something can be aesthetically unpleasing, that can be unattractive, that can be, even unsettling. And clearly, I mean, there's a lot of films that discuss unsettling things that, as subject matter, as content, as plot device, that it's disturbing, unsettling, fearful. I mean, all of these negative emotions are commonly explored in film. But I think this film uses the very medium, is visually disturbing, and I don't know, you know what I mean? They were not afraid to move away from aesthetically pleasing,
Yeah, I chuckled there for a minute because I'm just sort of imagining having this conversation in a forum of like a big pop culture podcast where it's what's bizarre about those things is that it's almost impossible to criticize a movie. It's like you either love everything about it or you hate everything about it.
Yeah.
And so I find it like I find it so refreshing to be able to have a conversation about a movie that I actually really, really like, but that I can also say like, oh man, it's ugly. Like, it's funny to me that things like that are kind of so, especially in the like very mainstream senses and like very popular media, it's rare to find conversations like that. So I'm glad that we're able to discuss that.
And that's it's the most fun thing. Like that's what I love doing here. So let's do talk about them. Let's shift to. So tell me a little bit about your personal experience with the film. I want to remind people, because I think it's kind of interesting that there's like a decent age difference between the two of us. So the age at which I first saw this film, which I'll get to after you, is like quite a bit different than the age that you saw this film out. Not that I'm suggesting for a moment that age is some monolithic kind of decider, but it is interesting to kind of explore the different age period of your life that you kind of come in contact with art can definitely like have an impact.
Totally. I mean, because I think we're about 23 years apart.
Yeah, we're about 20. I'm 45, so
so 22.
There you go.
So definitely different. I mean, like different childhood experiences and things like that. Totally different worlds that we grew up in. But I think what's kind of interesting about that is, again, just that like the sense that I get from this is that it's again a movie from a bygone era, whereas the sense that you might get from it is because you probably grew up more so in a sense where movies like this were way more common. And even my childhood was filled with films that were, the early 2000s, and the film industry today are completely different beasts. They're totally different things. But I can't help but shake the sense that this movie either would not be picked up at all today by like a big distribution company and would never see the light of day theatrically, or it would be something so relegated to, a special screening for like a few days, and that would be kind of what it's shown as. But I think that the other thing about it is the subject matter, which of course is a lot about adultery and affairs and this whole idea of like split personality and banality of life. Like I think the monotony of his everyday life in this movie, I think, is a huge theme. And you of course have experienced things like that. You said that you've worked office jobs that felt like you were hitting your head against a brick wall every day, whereas I haven't. I was lucky enough to kind of land into doing a lot of film gigs, early on out of high school. So I thank God I never had to deal with that. But.
And even hey, look, it's there's no it's not a magical escape from the realities of life to work in film either. You will also suffer some of the cyclical nature of some things in life, that the patterns of life can sometimes be oppressive regardless of industry that you're in. But how old were you when you saw the film? And did you see it when it was released? Like
I didn't see it. No, I didn't see it in theaters. Okay. So it came out in 2013. Actually, let me see what the exact time of year it came out, because I can tell you pretty much.
I think September-ish.
So
right?
September 8th. So it premiered at TIFF. And that would have been when I was in grade 10. So it came out when I was in grade 10, and I think I saw it the first time when I was in grade 11. And again, it was funny. This is my first Villeneuve movie. And I only watched it because it takes place in Toronto and the neighboring city, Mississauga, which is where I live. And that to me is really interesting because Toronto is so rarely mentioned in cinema, but also like even less so, of course, Mississauga, which is basically just a suburb. But and there's things like, he drives by like Rathburn Road, and Rathburn Road is the place where there's like a big IMAX theater. So it's like you start recognizing all these things.
That's fun.
Living in LA, you've got a lot of that. And so that's literally why I watched it, because my friend was like, one of the places that he goes is like, there's those, I don't know if you remember in the movie, there was those weird kind of shaped towers. That
they're beautiful.
So those are called the Marilyn Monroe buildings here.
Oh, wow.
They're like designed to kind of look like Marilyn Monroe, and those are like kind of like the centerpiece of like the Mississauga skyline.
Be darned.
And so it's so funny seeing those, because like you can pretty much, like I'm so close. And so I remember my friend being like, the Marilyn Monroe buildings are in them and stuff. And I was like, that's so weird.
Just as sorry to like, for just a
no
second.
worries. Yeah.
Are they, is that actually what they're called Or is
No,
that
so I think they're called Absolute World Towers or something.
okay?
Yeah, but
Okay,
if you
but
look up
everybody
Marilyn
just
Monroe,
calls them Marilyn Monroe. That's
yeah,
really
because they're
cool.
designed to look kind of like her figure.
I see.
Um, but yeah, so those so that was literally like I had no real knowledge of Villeneuve at that point. I
Yeah.
had heard of him because he made a pretty big movie here called Polytechnique, which was about a school shooting that happened in quite a while ago. I can't remember the exact year of it.
Yeah.
And that was a big thing in Canada, so he kind of made his name up here with that movie.
Okay.
And Incendies, which was kind of big here as well.
Yeah.
But I'd never seen either of those, and so this was really my first Villeneuve movie. And again, I didn't know anything about it going into it. The only reason I was watching it was because I thought it would be cool to kind of point out locations that I knew.
Sure.
And again, even back then, I was like so mesmerized by this movie and so enthralled by how grounded it feels, and that the visual effects are always like, there's not a lot of visual effects in this, but the visual effects that are in there are so ingrained in the world that this movie presents, that they're never presented as shocking or out of the ordinary. I could see this movie being directed in a completely different way where the image of the giant spider walking over Toronto is done in a way that makes it shocking to the viewer, and this
sensationalized, dramatic,
and that you're on the ground looking up at it or something like that. But it literally just cuts to an establishing shot of Toronto with a giant spider walking over it. There's no fanfare about it. So I think that was really what kind of encapsulated me, and it also I almost, forgive me for kind of simplifying perhaps the direction of Villeneuve here, but it almost, to me, also sort of feels like Villeneuve doing like Fincher in a way. Like it feels a lot tonally,
that's interesting.
sort of like
that's interesting.
like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and in a tonal sense.
I feel like in some senses these two directors are actually very similar, because I also get often a kind of cold, kind of clinical, kind of detached technical feeling from Fincher in a lot of his movies.
Yeah.
And I get that feeling with Denny too.
Yes. Yeah. Especially, I mean, Dune just came out.
Yep.
And I think that's like I thought Dune was decent. I enjoyed it. I saw it.
Yeah, I thought it was
times,
okay.
especially in IMAX. It was.
I wasn't
cool to
blown
see.
away. Wasn't blown
but a lot
away.
of people's complaints about that movie is exactly this kind of sterility, that there's not a lot of.
But we're gonna get to that too. You've got a really interesting thing, and I've never really thought about it. I want to save it. I want to save it. But the Canadian
we'll get to that
curse
after,
you called it. Yeah, the Canadian curse you called it. And obviously you don't have to be Canadian for a filmmaker to kind of maybe be considered categorized. But we're gonna get to that. I was really intrigued by this idea. So okay, so you see it at grade 10. That's a sophomore in high school here. And you were captivated by it right off the bat.
Yeah, and I thought that, and it was one of those things.
Do you remember like what it made you think about, what it made you feel? Was it disturbing?
I think it was just a little. I mean, I've always been super into, as I mentioned, like this, like 70s paranormal. Like The Conversation has always been one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, I love that film. Yeah,
All the President's Men,
Blow Up,
and then again, as I already have mentioned as well, is like Eyes Wide Shut. I find that to be such a fascinating, intriguing movie.
I like that film
again,
a lot.
It's what bothers me so much is that I find it so difficult to describe necessarily what I like about this movie in detail, other than the fact that it puts me like, it's almost like a trance. Like it's like it's so far out from anything that I would ever do that it makes me think a lot about just the way that the story is told, that there's not really like a rising action. There's not, he doesn't put any emphasis on pressure or suspense or things like that, but yet
there's not a lot of dynamic
movie
range.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, obviously, like, okay, so we talk a lot in this podcast as kind of filmmakers ourselves and cinephiles ourselves. And, I mean, oftentimes we'll get very technical, we get pretty granular, but I don't want to miss either, like, kind of, we're just like audiences too, we're just human beings, and we watch films and we're moved or not moved, or, and I'm just kind of curious if you could elaborate little bit more, just as an audience member, like watching the story be told in front of you with moving pictures. Do you recall kind of, what any other ways that it might have made you feel?
I think that the thing was that I was strangely invested, and that's one of the things that I think we're also kind of want to discuss, is that there's like a very big disconnect with feeling what the characters are feeling in this movie. That you don't really, you're not really like attached or like rooting for Gyllenhaal to kind of like figure this out. You're more
Or
just
any
kind
of the
of
characters.
along the ride with them.
Yeah.
Exactly. You don't really get to know many of the characters very well.
Right.
But I think at the same time, I think what kind of like hooked me about it was just that I was still so like it's like peeling off a band-aid. Like it's like I'm still just waiting to see what's under there and like what is making the movie tick. And it's
Okay.
it's a really kind of odd sensation
A
to
curiosity.
have.
It's like almost
Exactly.
like a
Like it
morbid
makes me very,
curiosity,
it really
maybe.
piques your curiosity. Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
It really
yeah.
piques my curiosity.
I
Yeah.
respect that, man. That's very interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. And especially at that age, you're kind of younger. I mean, obviously, like the subject matter and themes of this film are intense. So I was just curious, kind of as a younger person, how that film might have made you feel. And I remember too, when I was, and this is kind of sad in a way, totally, we're just digressing all over the place on this podcast, but I feel like it was much easier for me to be significantly emotionally affected by film when I was younger. Now, of course, it
Right. Okay, that
absolutely
makes sense.
and it absolutely still happens to me today. Of course, I mean, I didn't turn into a robot, but there is a difference between a preteen and teenage mind and then the mind of a 45-year-old person. We
of course,
evolve,
yeah.
we go through more life, but I think there's like this sweet spot, of almost like kind of 12 to maybe 20 or something, where your hormones are kind of going and your life seems like everything is kind of new and an experience, and you really like, I think we're open to much more range of emotional experience at that age.
And who knows if I would have like had the same, like if I had watched this movie for the first time now,
Yeah,
would
who
I
knows?
have
We'll never know.
reacted similarly, or would I have, had sort of an approach that you had, where it's like kind of the stuff that I like is more set in stone in a way.
Yeah.
And so I wonder.
Yeah, it's just interesting to think.
Well, 'cause
like,
did you see this in theaters, or do you remember if you
yeah.
watched it?
So for me, I didn't watch it in the theater. I do remember, seeing like preview footage of it and being, and certainly like the aesthetic caught my eye. I mean, there's no like, this doesn't look like any other film I've seen, and I think some of the promo footage showed like the spider landscape of Toronto, and everything is yellow, and it's quite striking. And I was like, "Ooh, okay, I don't know anything about this, but it's different." And of course, that caught my attention. I'm like, "This is different. This is not Marvel. This is not," I'm like, which wasn't as dominating in 2013.
Yeah, I guess the Avengers, the first Avengers movie had just come out a year before this. So,
but I was like, oh, okay, this looks interesting. Now, I did not go see it at the theater, though. I ended up not seeing it at the theater, but I think once it was finally released at home, I did watch it at home. And I don't remember being, particularly emotionally moved. I was kind of, I don't know. I think the distance at which the film kind of kept me with its kind of like the, that it's so symbolic and such like I feel like it's just a big metaphor, which is okay. But I think it kind of kept me from empathizing with the characters and kind of putting myself in any of those characters' positions in the film, which I think is one of the big ways that I enter a story, is that I, what many of us do, of course, where I kind of pick a character that and that can change throughout the whole movie, and maybe in this scene I feel related to that character, and then the next scene I feel related to this character, and go back and forth and everything. But I felt like there was no entrance into this film for me in that way, where I could put myself in the shoes of any of these characters and kind of feel with them. So that was a challenge that kept me at a distance. The other thing that kept me at a distance, and it's definitely on purpose, is the aesthetic of the film, which we'll get into a little more when we talk about direction and cinematography. So I think the combination of the aesthetic of the film and the kind of the distance that the characters are kept from us, I think kept me from really feeling connected to this picture.
And I think you described interestingly, sort of like that there's like almost hinges of, not in like an amateurish sense, but the storytelling style, it sort of feels almost like student film almost.
Well, and I
think that what's interesting about that is that, I know exactly what you mean, in that like student films, and I'm guilty of this in movies that I made when I was younger as well, where you almost try to keep things like intriguingly vague.
Yes.
And that's how you're, and I actually,
and it's like
had
your
a conversation with someone the other day, because they're writing a screenplay that they want me to direct, but they're just kind of starting out in terms of like their like film career and stuff like that. And so that was one of the pointers that I gave them, was I was like, if you really want to set this aside from like a lot of other short films that'll go up on YouTube or Vimeo and stuff, it's that like take all the vagueness out of it. Like,
yes.
Make it something that's super clear and concise and efficient in the way that you tell the story. Whereas, and it doesn't necessarily bother me a ton with this, just because I think that the atmosphere of the movie is really intriguing and interesting. But no, I totally get what you mean. Like I made movies when I was younger where, it's like,
everything
the only way
is
that
plotting.
a character can communicate is through
everything is brooding. Everything
yes.
is glacial. And so fast forward now, because I watched this probably in 2014 or 2015 when it first came out. So fast forward 6 years, and I watched it, of course, again last night in preparation for this. And I felt all those same things again. But yes, as you mentioned, not to be rude to student filmmakers, and because I have been there myself, and it's a shorthand, I think, to mean amateur or filmmakers who are kind of just beginning. That's all I mean. So
like a negative context.
Yes, I don't mean any disrespect to anyone at all. It's just a shorthand for, and I've been there too. So where I think vagueness replaces decisions. That's what I think we're kind of talking about but I don't feel like that's what's taking place here. I don't feel like vagueness is replacing the decisions that need to be made as an artist for a film. But I think what I mean here about the kind of a student film feel for me here is more superficial. Is more just about, I think, kind of the one noteness of the film, the glacial pace of the film, the brooding over the images. Those are kind of the elements that I think superficially remind me of a lot of amateur work that I've seen. But the big difference, though, is that I really do feel like this is strong, conscious decisions by this filmmaker, as opposed to the lack of a strong decision being made, and that's why there's vagueness for an amateur filmmaker. So I do think it's fundamentally different, but I think in some ways they look the same, if that makes sense.
Totally. No, that makes absolute sense. Yeah. I think that's there's like hints of it, but it's almost odd that it's done not odd in a negative sense, but it's the way that I would describe it is that there's an intentional self-awareness to it. As opposed to a student film just trying to mask the lack of a story with vagueness and stuff like that. Which again, we've all been there. So.
We've all been there. And I get it, and because I know one of the first things that, a lot of, like, I was just working with a writer recently, and I had kind of the same feedback as the story you described. They were, I could tell in reading the script that they were hyper concerned about giving away too much, about being too literal, about being on the nose. And that fear was so great that so many things were lost and not communicated to the audience in the script because of that fear. And so the reaction to that fear was such an overcompensation that I was like, I don't even know what the heck's going on here, dude. Nobody that watches this film, if it's made from the script as it is now, is even going to know what in the world you're talking about. So
no, exactly.
So sometimes I think, having a confidence in the story that you're telling is important. And that comes with age and experience, or at least experience, and this clearly is a confident film. Like, I would never say, wow, this is not a confident film. It's definitely a confidently made film. I mean,
certainly, yeah.
And let's talk a little bit more about that direction then. I mean, so what did we say? This sits kind of in the middle of Denis' filmography. He had
this is kind of, I guess, the I would say the middle of his filmography, but almost like the right on the start of his big kind of
international
break.
Like we're at least
he did Prisoners the same year as this, which is a totally different movie, feels completely different.
And I think that's his first American film, right? I think all of his previous films
and Deakins did the cinematography for it, and so
so that was big. And then I think Enemy is a smaller film. I don't think that was a huge thing for him. But then Sicario was monumental.
Really
I mean, that's a very much more traditional film. It was huge. I think Arrival was really well received. Obviously, Blade Runner was gigantic, and I mean that if you didn't know who he was before Blade Runner 2049, then you knew who he was at that point.
He's become the point where, I think as most directors aspire to be, where it's like his name is a part of the advertising.
Exactly.
That when Dune came out, it's Denis Villeneuve's Dune. It's not just Dune directed by this guy.
It's a big deal. So clearly he's one of the biggest. I think he's one of the biggest directors working today, especially with his Dune. I think it's going to be at least a trilogy. I think, right, or several films.
Yeah, I think they've announced the second one, and then they probably will make a third one based on how the second one does. But
be interested to see. But I think clearly there's really strong decision making being made here by this director. I think moving from the themes that the film is kind of exploring, and you touched on that a little bit. We'll talk about it, but the surreality of the surreal nature of the film, the confidence to tell a symbolic, metaphorical story, but without drawing really any, like you said, even the special effects shots, the spider stuff, it's shown so matter-of-factly. It's shown I love, frankly, frankly, the best part of the film to me is that final scene where he's speaking to his pregnant wife. She leaves the shower. She stops responding. And he goes into the bedroom, and she's turned into a giant spider who's now afraid of him, kind of cowers in the corner. And we cut back to a reaction shot of Jake's character, and he's just like,
he just sighs,
and just sighs,
and it's like it's this realization that, like, okay, this cycle
just to resign.
Is
it's
again.
Like it's beginning again. And so I so respect that. That's such confident filmmaking to me, that he did not have to overemphasize or sensationalize any of these choices. I mean, that I have a high degree of respect for that.
Definitely. It's refreshing in the sense also that, again, it doesn't over-explain itself.
That's another thing.
It doesn't very much in line with, like, I'm sure a lot of people saw that last scene and were like, wait, why isn't he scared of the fact that there's a giant spider?
Or even just, how did she turn into a spider? What's going on?
Yeah. And there's this quote that I think I said it when we were talking about Silence of the Lambs, which is Jonathan Demme said when directing Silence of the Lambs that he would rather an audience be confused for 5 minutes than be told what's going on every second. So that there's this, I think Villeneuve really, whether or not he's directly, inspired by that or not, which I think it's just a natural kind of gift that some directors have, that they don't feel the need to over-explain. They don't feel the need to have, Jake Gyllenhaal visit a psychiatrist in this movie and have the psychiatrist be like, oh, this is your condition, it does this, and and it's like he doesn't like read a book on what spiders mean in psychology at one point, or like,
so this is
just very much as using things as bits of metaphor and symbolism and stuff like that. And sure, it's definitely a movie that is, as I sort of described it as, like, up its own ass with its symbolism.
Well, that's what I want to talk about.
But I don't necessarily, that doesn't take away from the film for me for some reason. Normally it would. There's a lot of movies that I think that it would definitely get a little bit eye-rolly for me. But for some reason, and again, this is where it comes up where I'm like, I can't describe beyond just sort of like the feeling that I get during the movie, that I forgive this movie for, that I actually kind of enjoy.
I mean, I think the film is clearly successful at imparting a tone. I mean, there is an atmosphere. So there's no question there that, I think this film very successfully conveys an atmosphere and a tone that exist as a successful container for the symbology, if that makes sense. So that you can hold it and it's not ridiculous to you. I think it's true what you said, that he doesn't explicitly he doesn't have characters, explaining how they're feeling in dialogue. He doesn't explicitly explain that, no, there aren't two of these main characters, that this is this is symbolic, this is a representation of his psyche, et cetera, right? He doesn't go in to explain those things, but I do get a little bit of a sense that it's still sometimes heavy-handed to me.
No, without a doubt. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, he doesn't explicitly explain things, but I mean, he is very, it's like with, the history lessons, it's like over and over kind of about, the obsession with control and,
Yeah.
and we see the cycles and I feel like some of it is a little heavy handed.
It knows what its themes are.
It definitely knows, and it focuses on them for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's a very conscious decision to I feel like every scene of this film is about its themes. So that's true. Yeah. I mean, that's,
without a doubt.
And obviously the imparting these themes or exploring these themes, it was, I think, the highest priority for this film. So, I think that's fair to say. It's, that everything else is subservient to and supports that exploration of these themes, which, it can be interpreted to be different things by people. In my mind, when I saw it, well, I'd be curious before I say that, like, what do you feel like were some of the main, like when you watched it, I'm curious, especially when you were 10, I mean, or not in 10, but when you were in 10th grade.
Yeah, great, yeah.
Like what themes kind of jumped out to you? Do you remember kind of what
just
you
this
thought
idea,
the film
I
might
think
have
of,
been about, or?
Yeah, I think my ideas were, and again, this is not completely exact because I don't remember exactly.
Yeah,
but
sure,
I remember
sure.
this, just definitely the feelings of like control, monotony, sameness in life, but it's not. I think what interested me then too was that there's so many movies about monotony and sameness, and where someone like Fight Club, for example, where it's like, oh, I want to break out of this monotony. But that's not what this is. It's more about like the monotony driving somebody insane. And getting to them a point of like where it's kind of like a split personality thing, and you've got this, but that there's this like there's also this weird deniability in it that it's one of those things where you, along with other characters in the film, you don't know if he's genuinely ill, if he genuinely has this split personality, or if it's something that's like, because at the end of it, especially in the final moments of the film when he sees the spider, you get this sense by his facial expression that he's like, no, I invent this other person in my head, and I know, but I'm never going to tell anybody that I invent them. That it's like I can't, because that's what keeps me sane. And then when he sees the spider, he's like, all right, well, back to square one kind of thing.
Interesting. And so do you feel like this is kind of like the themes that you feel that jump out to you today as well, or what your research?
A lot of the similar stuff. Yeah, definitely more. I mean, I think I understand the dynamics of like the actual relationships more because I've had more experience in that kind of avenue of life where of like having difficult conversations about paranoia in relationships, jealousy, things like that. And so I think on that level, I understand those things more than obviously I did when I was in grade 10.
Sure.
But to the level of, a broad, I would say, like thematic kind of reaction to the movie, I'd say that I have had pretty similar reactions every single time I've watched it. I've only seen it, I think four or five. I would lean towards 4. I think I've only seen it 4 times over the course of nearly 10 years. So it's not a movie that like I sit down and watch every year and that like I'm a huge fan of. It's not necessarily one that's like in my favorite movies of all time. But again, like you said, I find this movie really intriguing. I think it's a really my response coming out of this movie is something that's like, I appreciate this movie a lot, and I appreciate the direction, and just for its uniqueness, if nothing else, that it's really refreshing to see something like this. And again, that's kind of why I described it as like something that it would just be relegated to like Amazon Prime. That it wouldn't have a big release, it wouldn't be in theaters, it would just be movies like this just aren't really made anymore, or at least aren't given the same spotlight that even it would have been done when it came out.
Well, I think, some of the themes that jump out at me, and this is one area that I enjoy, I kind of both enjoy, but then I'm kind of, about this, I think, one of the themes that stands out to me are, the film seems to kind of center around infidelity or relationships. And I certainly I sometimes get so burned out on infidelity being such a crutch for a story for films that it just like, I mean, I know that it's an important or a significant part of what a lot of people in life have to deal with in real life.
Mm-hmm.
But
And
God,
it's very
sometimes
easily dramatic. And,
but it's so easily dramatized, and I feel like sometimes it's handled in such the same way over and over and over that it's a trope, basically. It's like the male infidelity thing is a trope in film that sometimes is just kind of annoying and boring. So I will say that, because my kind of interpretation is that I think that infidelity is key, and I think that the way the film is booked, it begins and opens with this erotic scene or this, where they're at this sex club. I mean, they're literally at the sex club. I think that it's kind of a symbolic of kind of this lustful thinking that's going on in the character's mind. I don't think it's necessarily literal, but there are two women. One is his wife, one is a girlfriend, and one is always kind of bathed in white, one is always presented in dark, so they're kind of this yin yang.
And they look sort of similar.
But you can easily tell them apart.
Yeah.
One is softer, one is kind of more, angular. But of course they're both beautiful. And I think this film is about the cycle of infidelity for him. And maybe that's even too literal. Maybe it's about a cycle of, or the struggle of, of managing love and lust, and that there's temptation in the world.
Control, again, as we've talked about, like that. There's this idea of
and so at least I'm like, well, thank God at least that they explored this in a different way.
Well, I mean, the other thing too is that like every female character in the movie is like in a way, in a very literal sense, like kind of domineering. That like his mother
it's all over.
Is
the symbology of it is everywhere. Yeah, the symbology of this
like
is everywhere.
His mother kind of talks to him like he's
all the
still,
time,
like young,
constant.
And his both of his, both the girls that he's seeing are very much not necessarily in control of him, but you can tell where the paranoia that he has kind of builds up from.
It's the spider analogy. It's it's the web. It's the fear of control, and it's the fear of commitment, and
getting
it's
caught
the
up
feeling
in something
of getting caught up in something.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when you have a real, genuine, authentic relationship with someone that's deep. You do get caught up with each other. You get entangled with someone tremendously on every level when you're actually in a real adult relationship. And that's scary for a lot of people. And for a lot of people, they have a really difficult time, I think, managing that. So I get that. That's interesting to explore that fear that exists when you make yourself vulnerable and you commit yourself to someone. That's very interesting. But, this is where some of the stuff like the spider analogy, I mean, it seems sometimes a little heavy-handed that, yes, women are spiders and that they cast their web and men get stuck in it, and that, that you have a picture of the poster of the 50-foot woman in the video shop, and then we cut to, well, we don't directly cut to, but then later we see the giant spider in the landscape of Toronto. We see the spider web fracture of the windshield, when there's the car accident.
At the beginning, it's the beginning of the cycle of him in the sex club, and she steps on the tarantula. And
there's that too, but there's a spider web. Actually, the glass shatters in a spider web pattern when they have the car accident, when they're fighting and they have the car accident. So
and it's like cyclical though. Like it's very clear that this is something that
it's a cycle.
His wife literally asks him at one point, "Are you seeing her again?"
Everything and his history lessons, and yes, we get a sense of the cycle that it's and of course the ending of it is that okay, he's finally killed off this alter ego or this temptation, or however you want to kind of describe it or interpret it. And what's like literally the next thing that happens? It's like the next morning, he's like, "Oh, I've got this key. Oh, hey wife, are you busy tonight? I've got to go somewhere." So temptation wins again, and that's of course.
And I mean, again, and then like it's not doesn't hide, like even his mother says, and give up on that amateur acting career that you're trying to do. So it's like, it doesn't hide this fact that these two people are one and the same.
No, there's a lot of
That it's
hints.
him.
I think it's
It's very
obvious.
much him, very much
Yeah.
grappling with two sides of his. Like I don't think it's a literal.
No.
The movie's not supposed to literally mean that this guy has a split personality disorder
No.
where he like
No.
fakes memories in a mental health sense,
No, it's
but
about the
rather that it
duality
uses
we
this
all have.
idea, and it's surreal. Like it's a surrealist movie, so it's using
Well, interestingly, I mean,
metaphor
it's not
for.
surrealist mostly. Aside from the spider stuff, it's not visually surreal. So
No,
I
no,
think
but
I
very
think
much the
that's
way that the story is told
yeah. But I
is,
think that's where if someone gets a little confused, I think that's likely why. I think it's because
yeah,
you have this is a visual like this story is a representation of someone's psyche, right?
yeah,
and
exactly,
and
yeah,
it's about the duality that exists in all of us, or more than two. I mean, there are many facets of all of our personalities, and there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. We want to do one thing, but we are tempted to do another thing, and sometimes we succeed in doing what we feel like our higher, better self would do, and sometimes we fail and we do a more base thing. If that, I mean, we get complicated into like ethics and everything. So it's hard sometimes to even create a hierarchy of actions, but. My point is just that all of us experience cognitive dissonance, and we're pulled in different directions.
Well, I
And we
mean,
do
and
the
to relate it too. I mean, I again go back to kind of even like the student film type of idea. It's that when I was, I made a movie probably 5 years ago now that
yeah.
isn't very good. But I remember that the whole point of it was that like this guy wakes up and the sun is like doesn't rise and the world is empty, and it was like a metaphor for him losing his girlfriend. And then there's this like piece of paper on his desk that he like communicate like that just it appeared like the words just appear on the paper and like basically
Uh-huh.
tell him things, and
Yeah.
and it was very much such a heavy-handed metaphor. And then like when he forgives himself, the sun rises again, and it not very good, but again, very much that student film thing, and it's kind of it's exactly like that. Like in that movie, is the sun literally not rising, or is it sort of more
Right.
vague? Is it more just again? It's a more of a metaphor. It's like those elements are supposed to be more surreal to represent something about
And
a
I'm happy to
character,
see that. And I'm
and,
happy to see
and
that
so that's
because
the thing, is that this movie does that far better than I did.
yeah.
But it still is. It's the same principle. It's the principle of like that you're taking something. This movie is not about someone literally struggling with the mental health issue that is split
No.
personality disorder.
And I don't
It's
think
using
I'd
that
be
sort of
hard pressed to
idea.
see that somebody would even interpret it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
I
Yeah.
don't think, but I do think though that this film. So I think what this film does is completely. I mean, it's common in art to do this. This is, I mean, this movie does nothing spectacular or weird or unique even in its representation of things in that manner. But I do think that it is becoming more unique in the landscape of current films. That is, it's rare that films are kind of metaphors and are symbolic and represent kind of, these subconscious kind of things that go on. And I think films are often quite literal generally, and they're very plot driven,
totally.
and they're
Yeah.
very much about, well, just what happens, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, like what tangibly happens in the world. Whether it's ridiculously fictional characters like Captain America and Spider-Man and Hulk, I mean, it's still, these films are just about like what is literally happening in their world. So I like to
Yes.
see
Yeah.
that. So even though I didn't enjoy watching this film, sometimes I thought that symbology was a little heavy-handed, I'm still really excited to see it. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and
I mean,
perhaps to kind of finish off, we can discuss that idea of like this kind of Canadian curse thing that I
well, yeah, because
that I
we
sort of
talked
coined.
about
Yeah.
performances. I mean, I think like we were talking about performances a little bit. We were kind of I was kind of in my mind like when I was interpreting it before you had kind of described this Canadian thing, I was like, well, the film, because I was thinking, trying to think of how could I define or what would I say about these performances, and I kind of felt like, well, there's not a whole lot for these actors to do. I mean, the film feels a little kind of flat, a little detached. I was trying to find some words to kind of describe it. I felt like the characters don't feel like kind of like fully human. So I was like, it's hard for me to really say, wow, any of these performances stood out to me. But you'd mentioned something that might explain some of this, and that is this
Yeah,
cultural
so
difference.
there's
Yeah,
there's this strange, and again, perhaps this is something that I'm more attuned to just because, growing up here and seeing
yeah,
more, cinema from this country, but there's this lack of show offness or the lack of being in your face or kind of lack of grandeur in a lot of Canadian cinema that's super
yeah,
subdued and super, that like it feels very flat and very
yeah,
sterile and very, and this goes back to even, and I'm a huge fan of David Cronenberg,
yeah.
but like you watch it like Videodrome, and it's like there's still this like there's this transactional relationship between
That I
everyone. Like
like
that
that
every relationship
description.
is almost like, yeah, it's like you're having every conversation feels transactional.
Yeah,
Um, and so there's this lack of empathizing with characters often where you don't really feel like, well, I know this person's like wants and desires, or I know what they're needing in this situation. I even the stories themselves are so often, you know, quite different from things that like it's not really coming of age. Like it's
mm-hmm,
not, or it's not something about like someone kind of trying to achieve a goal, but more so
mm-hmm.
an exploration of like, um, and I'll use Cronenberg again, but I'll use Videodrome, where it's like Videodrome is not a story about a man that's like trying to succeed in like, in uh like a news networking and things like
Right,
that. It's a
right.
story about a guy that's like dealing with obsession and
Yeah, it's
like
not
sexuality
aspirational.
and all
It's not
this.
an
Yeah.
aspirational story, which we get a lot of, and it's not a
Yeah.
goal-driven story, which you also get a lot of, right? It's like, and if you read almost any screenwriting book that was written in the past 20 years, it's like your character must be likable and they
Hmm.
must have a goal that they must work to achieve and they must
And
have
so much of
obstacles.
it's so
Yeah.
much of Canadian cinema is like that. Like I'd say the majority of it, and I say curse not necessarily in a totally negative sense. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of really really fantastic movies made here, like that are fully made here, not just Hollywood movies shooting here.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, there's also like this really interesting kind of feel to a lot of like Canadian cinema, which is just this like flat sort of less emotional,
Mm-hmm.
less empathetic, much more I would say exploratory than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
That they're so often exploring controversial issues or
Hmm.
um, taboo subjects,
Mm-hmm.
things like that are I think make things really interesting, but also one of those things that is to me a super super almost like a hallmark of Canadian cinema.
That's so interesting.
Um,
I hadn't really thought of that too much. I'd be
mhm.
curious, not that we can answer this question here or, but it would be interesting to kind of think about and look at why that might be. And that's very curious. I think, maybe some immediate kind of, this is just me completely kind of speaking off the cuff, off the top of my head, but I wonder if some of that difference is kind of, here in the United States, at least, I mean, I can speak to the United States. I've lived here my entire life. Our culture here is A, very aspirational. B, we have a very kind of strong kind of undercurrent of a specific kind of morality, I think,
Mhm.
that sometimes precludes us from being able to easily explore taboo subjects. I mean, there's a lot of taboo subjects in the United States, so some of them are
Mhm.
quite interesting. So, this film in particular explores to some extent, sexuality, relationships, monogamy, fidelity, and of course, in the United States, you can explore violence all day long, right? You could have a
Yeah.
film that
Yeah.
explores violence, and violence is such a, I mean, it's just everywhere in American cinema. But if you get into some of these other questions, that you could run into some taboo stuff real quickly, right?
Mhm.
Um, so that's interesting. I mean, maybe there's some difference there
Well, I mean, also we've
in
got such a
Canadian
like
culture.
heavy, especially obviously Villeneuve being from Trois-Rivières, but that you've got these like a huge amount of French influence on our
Hmm.
cinema. That a lot of
Yeah,
the big filmmakers here are from French Canada. So that obviously is going to be detached more so from the American style of cinema, which there is, huge influence on here as well because we're so close, culturally and geographically.
right.
But that Quebec really tends to be a lot more European in its style, and that bleeds out through the rest of Canada. So
Yeah,
there's almost like this kind of homogenous section of Canada that's super European that affects so much of what there's so much public funding for film here. There's
right.
a lot
Which
of
is
things like
wonderful.
that, but you go and you look at that and you look a lot of the movies that are funded publicly here. And yeah, there's a ton of, I would say, a much more European slant at the way that films are made and shot and stories are presented here than American, which is very, very interesting. And perhaps it might also just be because we have American cinema, and that, a lot of Canadians filmmakers to kind of differentiate themselves from that, decide to go in the route that is a lot more of a Quebecois style versus, in a more American style of film and storytelling.
Right.
And it's not to say that one is better than the other by any means, but that more so I appreciate in a sense a lot more than I did when I was a kid, where of course you just want, Indiana Jones or Top Gun or something like that as a kid, because you're like, why is all Canadian cinema so
there's
boring?
A place for both. There's
exactly.
There's a place.
And I
for...
still love Indiana Jones. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
Most of my favorite movies are American, but there's certainly a growing appreciation for me, especially as I got older, in Canadian cinema, and looking at that sort of thing and seeing kind of, again, those through lines and understanding kind of why certain things are certain ways. I mean, we have harsh winters. Maybe it's just that. Maybe it's literally just that our winters are so bad that it makes us all depressed and makes all our movies flat and emotional.
There's a lot of demographic differences, religious differences, historical differences.
Definitely,
So that's always interesting to explore, and it's fun to see the differences in art that come from different cultures, and similarities. So yeah, it's just very intriguing. But I had never really thought about that. I think I kind of take for granted sometimes that although you are geographically close, there are still some significant cultural differences, and that's obviously going to manifest in the films that come from Canada versus the United States in a lot of instances. Not that Canadians can't make great actions, whatever you might categorize American cinema as, of course, and vice versa. It's not that at all. But it's just an interesting.
I mean, James
lens.
Cameron is
Oh
from
my gosh,
Canada, but he clearly kind of very much jumped into the American film.
He couldn't be
industry.
more American, I feel like,
Yeah. Like his movies, his movies are totally American too.
Yeah.
That Avatar and Titanic and all those are American produced movies. So
yeah.
But
completely.
it's just kind of an interesting that in terms of Canadian cinema not just being made by Canadians, but like the actual genre of cinema. There's a very specific feel to it. And this certainly, if you've never seen anything before, if you're not from Canada, if you want to kind of perhaps get a taste of what it's like, this is, I would say, a good place to start. Cronenberg's movies, maybe lesser so than The Fly, because that was a kind of a co-produced American film.
Yeah.
But I'd say like Videodrome and a lot of those movies that explore, again, these taboo subjects those are kind of good places to start if you want to jump into it.
Yeah. Excellent, man. Well, fantastic. Well, I appreciate you bringing Enemy into our podcast to discuss. It's enjoyable, and I think it's especially interesting. I mean, a lot of the films that we've done in the past, I think it was like I enjoyed them, and I enjoyed them on a kind of a superficial level, and I respected them. And this was an interesting film for me where I really didn't enjoy it on a personal kind of audience level, but there's a ton here to respect, and there's a lot here to kind of stimulate thinking about filmmaking, and that's awesome. That's a blast. So awesome. Well, I guess that'll be a wrap for episode 47.
Yes,
As always, Cullen, it's been a pleasure. And everybody out there who's listening, we appreciate you. We hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you next time on episode 48. Until then, take care, everybody.
Yeah, bye-bye.